On the day of my mother's funeral, my wife was throwing a party at our house with another man. I said nothing. I had already installed hidden cameras. In court, when she asked for half of everything, I handed the judge a recording. When he pressed play, her blood ran cold. I'm glad to have you here. Follow my story until the end and comment the city you are watching from so I can see how far my story has reached. I pulled into my driveway at 9:30 in the evening, exhausted from the longest day of my life. The funeral service had drained every ounce of emotional strength I had left. My mother Eleanor had been my anchor for 60 years, and now she was gone. All I wanted was to collapse into bed and let the grief wash over me in the privacy of my own home. But as I approached my front door, something was wrong. Music. Laughter. The warm glow of lights spilling through the windows told me Hannah was entertaining guests. On the night of my mother's funeral, I stood frozen on my own doorstep, key in hand, trying to process what I was hearing. The sound of clinking glasses mixed with Hannah's distinctive laugh cut through the evening air like a knife. My chest tightened as I slowly turned the key and stepped inside. The living room was filled with people I barely recognized. Hannah's book club friends, neighbors I hadn't spoken to in months, and in the center of it all, a man I'd never seen before. He was tall, maybe in his early 50s, with salt and pepper hair and an expensive suit. He stood too close to my wife, his hand resting casually on her lower back. Hannah spotted me first. Her face shifted from carefree joy to what I can only describe as forced sympathy, but not before I caught that split second of annoyance at my unexpected arrival. "Oh, honey," she said, rushing toward me with arms outstretched. "You're home. How are you holding up?" The concern in her voice felt rehearsed, performed for the audience around us. I glanced over her shoulder at the man in the expensive suit, who was watching our interaction with what looked like amusement. "I'm tired," I said simply, because I didn't trust myself to say more. "Of course you are, sweetheart." Hannah's hand touched my arm, but there was no warmth in it. "I thought it would be good to have some friends over. You know, to lift the spirits. Death is so depressing, and I felt like we needed some positive energy in the house." Positive energy. On the night I buried my mother. "Everyone," Hannah announced to the room. "This is my husband Ronald. He just got back from his mother's funeral." A collective murmur of sympathy rippled through the group, but I could see it in their eyes. They were uncomfortable. They knew this was wrong, but none of them had the courage to say it. The man in the expensive suit stepped forward, extending his hand with a practiced smile. "I'm so sorry for your loss, Ronald. I'm Mark Davidson. Hannah's told me so much about you." His grip was firm, confident. The kind of handshake that belonged to a man who was used to getting what he wanted. But what struck me wasn't his confidence. It was the way Hannah's face lit up when he said her name, and how quickly she looked away when she realized I was watching. "Mark's been such a comfort to me during this difficult time," Hannah said, her voice taking on that syrupy, sweet tone she used when she was lying. "He lost his own mother last year, so he really understands what we're going through." We, as if she had lost anything. As if she had spent the last 3 months driving to the hospital every day, holding my mother's hand while she slowly slipped away. As if she had been the one to make the impossible decisions about end-of-life care. I excused myself and walked upstairs, my legs feeling heavy with each step. From the bedroom window I could see into the backyard where more people had gathered around our patio table. Hannah had set out the good china, the plates that belonged to my mother that we'd brought back from her house just 2 days ago. They were eating off my dead mother's dishes while celebrating God knows what. I sat on the edge of my bed, still wearing the black suit I'd worn to say goodbye to the woman who raised me, and listened to my wife's laughter floating up through the floorboards. There was something different about that laugh, something I'd never heard before in our 12 years of marriage. It was free, uninhibited, like the sound of someone who had been holding their breath and could finally exhale. At 11:15 I heard cars starting up in the driveway, voices calling out their goodbyes, promises to get together soon. Through the bedroom window I watched Mark Davidson walk to his car, a sleek black BMW that probably cost more than I made in 6 months. But he didn't leave immediately. He stood by his car, looking back at the house, waiting. Hannah appeared in the doorway a moment later. I couldn't hear their conversation, but I could see their body language. The way she touched his arm, The way he leaned down to whisper something in her ear that made her smile. The way they stood just a little too close for a little too long before he finally got in his car and drove away. When Hannah came to bed an hour later, I pretended to be asleep. She slipped under the covers without a word, but I could feel the energy radiating from her body. She wasn't tired. She was wired, excited about something. On the night of my mother's funeral, my wife was lying next to me, practically vibrating with anticipation. I stared at the ceiling until dawn, my mind racing with questions I didn't want to ask and answers I didn't want to know. But one thought kept circling back, growing stronger with each passing hour. This wasn't the first time Mark Davidson had been in my house. The way he moved through the rooms, the casual familiarity with which he helped himself to drinks from our bar, the ease with which Hannah had introduced him to her friends. This was a man who belonged here. And if that was true, then everything I thought I knew about my marriage was a lie. By the time the sun came up, I had made a decision. I wasn't going to confront Hannah. I wasn't going to demand answers or threaten divorce or do any of the things a betrayed husband was supposed to do. Instead, I was going to watch. I was going to wait, and I was going to find out exactly what my wife had been hiding from me. The next morning, while Hannah slept in after her party, I drove to the electronics store downtown and bought 4 small security cameras with motion detection and audio recording capabilities. The salesman assured me they were virtually invisible once installed and could be monitored remotely from my phone. When I returned home, Hannah was in the shower. I had maybe 15 minutes before she came downstairs expecting breakfast and sympathy for her imaginary hangover. I worked quickly, installing cameras in the living room, kitchen, hallway, and her home office. Each one perfectly positioned to capture not just images, but conversations, movements, the subtle interactions that would tell me who my wife really was when she thought no one was watching. As I finished connecting the last camera to the wireless network, I heard the shower turn off upstairs. Hannah would be down soon, ready to play the role of the grieving daughter-in-law, the supportive wife helping her husband through his darkest hour. But now I would see her when the mask came off. I deleted the purchase history from my phone and threw away the packaging from the cameras. Then I went to the kitchen and started making coffee, just like I did every morning. Just like the devoted husband I had always been. But something fundamental had shifted inside me during that long, sleepless night. The man who had left for his mother's funeral yesterday morning was gone, buried alongside Eleanor in that cold cemetery plot. The man who remained was someone new, someone willing to be patient, to plan, to wait for the perfect moment to discover the truth. And as Hannah's footsteps echoed on the stairs above me, I smiled for the first time in weeks. Because I finally had a purpose again. I was going to find out who Mark Davidson really was and exactly how long my wife had been lying to me. The coffee finished brewing just as Hannah entered the kitchen, wrapped in her silk robe, hair still damp from the shower. She looked beautiful, as she always did, but for the first time in 12 years, her beauty left me completely cold. "Good morning, sweetheart," she said, kissing my cheek. "How did you sleep?" "Like the dead," I replied, pouring her coffee into the mug that had been my mother's favorite. Hannah didn't even notice the irony. 3 weeks had passed since the funeral, and the cameras had become my silent companions, watching when I couldn't, recording when I wasn't there. Every morning after Hannah left for her yoga class, at 10 I would review the footage from the previous day. What I discovered was far worse than I had imagined. The first recording that made my blood run cold was from a Tuesday afternoon. I had been at the doctor's office following up on some tests my physician had ordered after I'd lost 15 pounds during my mother's illness. Hannah knew exactly when I'd left and when I'd be back. The moment my car pulled out of the driveway, her phone was in her hand. "He's gone," she said, her voice light and excited. "You can come over now." 22 minutes later, Mark Davidson's black BMW pulled into my driveway. He didn't park on the street like a visitor. He parked right where I usually put my car, as if he belonged there. I watched through the camera as Hannah opened the door before he even knocked. She was wearing the red dress I'd bought her for our anniversary last year, the one she claimed was too fancy for everyday occasions. But apparently it wasn't too fancy for Mark. "Miss me?" he asked, wrapping his arms around her waist and lifting her off the ground. "Always," she whispered back, and then they kissed. Not the polite peck of friends, but the desperate, hungry kiss of lovers who had been apart too long. I had to stop the recording 3 times before I could watch the rest. Each time I pressed play, the betrayal felt fresh, like a physical blow to my chest. But I forced myself to continue watching because I needed to see everything. They moved to the living room where Hannah poured wine from a bottle I didn't recognize. Expensive wine, judging by the way Mark admired the label. They sat on my couch, her legs draped across his lap, talking and laughing like they'd been together for years. "How long do you think he'll need to grieve?" Mark asked, running his fingers through Hannah's hair. "A few more weeks, maybe a month," Hannah replied, taking a sip of wine. "He's very close to his mother. Was very close. God, I thought she'd never die." My hands shook as I gripped my phone. Hannah had visited my mother in the hospital exactly 3 times in her final months, and each visit lasted less than 15 minutes. She'd claimed the antiseptic smell made her nauseous, that seeing Eleanor so weak was too upsetting for her sensitive nature. I'd believed her. I'd even felt guilty for asking her to visit more often. "Poor Ronald," Mark said, but his tone was mocking rather than sympathetic. "Still has no idea what's going on right under his nose." "He's completely clueless," Hannah agreed. "Yesterday he thanked me for being so supportive during this difficult time. If he only knew how supportive I've been to you." They both laughed at that, a shared joke at my expense. I wanted to throw the phone across the room, but I forced myself to keep watching. "When are you going to tell him?" Mark asked. Hannah was quiet for a moment, swirling her wine thoughtfully. "Soon. I'm just waiting for the right moment. He needs to process his grief first, and then I'll sit him down and explain that our marriage has run its course, that we've grown in different directions. All that therapeutic nonsense that makes divorce sound like personal growth instead of what it really is." "And he'll just accept that?" "Ronald's always been passive. He doesn't fight for anything. He'll probably be relieved, honestly. I haven't exactly been hiding my disinterest in this marriage lately." That was true. Over the past year, Hannah had become increasingly distant. Fewer conversations over dinner, separate bedrooms citing my snoring, declined invitations to events she used to enjoy. I'd attributed it to stress from her job, the natural ebb and flow of a long marriage, the approaching reality of my mother's declining health. I told myself it was temporary, that we'd reconnect once life calmed down, but there was no stress at her job. There was no natural ebb and flow. There was only Mark Davison and the life she'd been building with him while I focused on my dying mother. "What about the house?" Mark asked. "Oh, we'll sell it. Ronald will want to downsize anyway, especially after what happened to his mother. All those medical bills probably wiped out most of his savings." I paused the recording, my heart pounding. Medical bills? My mother had excellent insurance, and I had been careful to handle all of her expenses within the coverage limits. There had been some out-of-pocket costs, maybe $3,000 total, hardly enough to impact our savings. But Hannah didn't know that because she'd never bothered to ask about the financial details. She'd simply assumed I was struggling and planned her future accordingly. I resumed the recording, dreading what else I might hear. "We could get something in the hills," Hannah continued. "I saw this beautiful place last week when I was driving around with Sarah. 4 bedrooms, granite countertops, a pool, much more our style than this suburban box." Our style. As if they were already a couple, already making decisions together about where to live and how to spend the money from selling my house. The recording went on for another 47 minutes. They talked about vacation plans for the summer, restaurants they wanted to try, couples they hoped to socialize with once their relationship was public. They talked about everything except the man whose life they were casually dismantling. But the most chilling moment came near the end when Mark checked his watch and said he needed to leave before I returned. "Same time Thursday?" he asked, kissing her goodbye. "Actually, Ronald has a dentist appointment Thursday afternoon. We could have the whole evening." "Perfect. I'll bring dinner from that Italian place you love." They had my schedule memorized. They knew my appointments, my routines, my habits well enough to plan their affair around them. This wasn't a recent development or a moment of weakness. This was a calculated long-term deception that had been going on for months, maybe longer. After reviewing that recording, I started paying closer attention to the patterns. Mark visited on average 3 times per week, always when I was away from the house for extended periods. He had a key to the back door, which explained how he'd been able to come and go without neighbors noticing. Hannah had given him access to my home, my sanctuary, the place where I'd grieved for my mother and worried about our marriage and never suspected that my wife was entertaining another man in my absence. The emotional recordings were bad enough, but the financial ones nearly sent me to the hospital. On a Friday afternoon, while I was visiting Eleanor's grave and bringing fresh flowers, Hannah was on the phone with someone discussing joint bank accounts and investment portfolios. "No, he doesn't pay attention to the statements," she was saying. "Ronald leaves all the financial management to me. He just assumes everything is fine." This was true. I'd always trusted Hannah to handle our household finances. She had an accounting background and seemed to enjoy managing budgets and investments. Every month she'd give me a summary of our financial position, and I'd nod approvingly and thank her for taking care of such tedious details. "The checking account has about 12,000 and there's maybe 45,000 in the retirement accounts," she continued, "plus whatever equity we have in the house." I nearly dropped my phone. We had closer to 90,000 in retirement savings, and the house was almost paid off. Hannah was either grossly mistaken about our financial position or she was deliberately understating our assets. Given everything else I discovered, I suspected the latter. "What about life insurance?" the voice on the other end asked. 200,000 through his work, but that's only if something happens while he's still employed. He's been talking about early retirement, which would complicate things. Early retirement. I'd mentioned it exactly once in passing after a particularly stressful day at the office. I'd said something about how nice it would be to retire at 62 and spend more time with family. Hannah had seemed supportive at the time, encouraging me to think about what I'd want to do with my free time. Now I understood her enthusiasm differently. Early retirement would eliminate the life insurance payout that was apparently part of her long-term financial planning. "Don't worry," Hannah continued. "I'll make sure he stays at work until we're ready to make our move. He's very focused on providing for our future. He won't retire if he thinks it would leave us financially vulnerable." Our future. She was talking about securing my life insurance while planning to leave me for another man. The cold calculation of it took my breath away. That night I sat in my study pretending to read while Hannah watched television in the living room. She was texting, constantly, smiling at her phone in a way she hadn't smiled at me in months. Every few minutes she would giggle softly at something on her screen, then glance toward the study to make sure I wasn't watching. I wasn't watching her. I was watching the live feed from the camera in the living room, reading her text messages on my phone as she typed them. "Can't wait for tomorrow," she wrote to Mark. "R will be at that work thing until late." "Should I bring anything special?" he replied. "Just yourself, and maybe that wine you brought last time. I want to celebrate." "What are we celebrating?" "I'll tell you tomorrow. Let's just say our timeline might be accelerating." I closed my eyes and leaned back in my chair. Accelerating timeline, celebration. Whatever Hannah was planning, it was happening soon, and it was going to be worse than anything I'd already discovered. I opened my laptop and began researching divorce lawyers, not because I was ready to file, but because I needed to understand my rights and options. What I found was sobering. In our state, Hannah would be entitled to half of all marital assets, including retirement accounts, home equity, and any inheritance received during the marriage. Inheritance. My mother had left me everything in her will, including the family home that had been paid off decades ago, her investment accounts, and several valuable pieces of jewelry that had been in our family for generations. The total value was significant, probably close to $300,000. And according to state law, Hannah would have a claim to half of it, unless she'd done something to disqualify herself from that claim. Adultery was still grounds for an unequal distribution of assets in divorce proceedings, but only if it could be proven with clear and convincing evidence. For the first time in weeks, I smiled as I looked at my phone where hours of recordings were stored in a secure cloud account. Clear and convincing evidence was exactly what I had, and more was being recorded every day. I just needed to be patient a little longer. Let Hannah and Mark continue their affair. Let them make their plans. Let them celebrate whatever timeline they were accelerating. Because when the time came for them to make their move, I would be ready with evidence they never imagined existed. The hunter had become the hunted, and they didn't even know they were being watched. The call came on a Wednesday morning while I was reviewing security footage from the previous day. Hannah had left early for what she claimed was a doctor's appointment, but the cameras showed her spending 2 hours at Mark's apartment complex instead. I was so focused on documenting her lies that I almost didn't answer when my phone rang. "Mr. Holloway, this is Patricia Morse from Morse, Anderson and Associates. I was your mother's attorney." My stomach tightened. I'd been expecting this call for weeks, but somehow it still caught me off guard. "Yes, Miss Morse. Thank you for calling. I'm sorry for your loss, Mr. Holloway. Your mother was a remarkable woman. I have her will ready for probate, and there are some matters we need to discuss in person. Would you be available to come in this afternoon?" I glanced at my calendar. Hannah wouldn't be home until evening, which meant I could meet with the attorney and review the inheritance details without her immediately demanding information she had no right to possess. 2 o'clock would work, I said. "Perfect. And, Mr. Holloway, you might want to bring a financial advisor with you. Your mother's estate is more substantial than you might expect." More substantial. Those words echoed in my mind as I drove to the law office. My mother had lived modestly her entire life. She'd worked as a secretary for the school district, clipped coupons, shopped sales, and never seemed to spend money on anything but necessities. But I'd also known she was careful with money, that she saved religiously and invested conservatively. Patricia Morse was a woman in her 70s with silver hair and sharp eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. She'd known my mother for over 20 years, handling her legal affairs with the same meticulous attention Eleanor had applied to everything in her life. "Your mother was very proud of you, Ronald," she said as she opened a thick file folder. "She talked about you constantly, your marriage, your career, how responsible you've always been." I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. The grief was still too raw, too close to the surface. "She was also very concerned about protecting what she'd built," Miss Morse continued. "Particularly in recent months, she mentioned that she had some worries about your wife." My blood went cold. "What kind of worries?" She never went into detail, but she did say that Hannah had been asking a lot of questions about family finances during her hospital visits. Questions that seemed inappropriate for someone who was supposedly there to provide emotional support. I thought back to Hannah's rare visits to the hospital. Each time she'd claimed they were too difficult for her, that seeing my mother so weak was overwhelming. But apparently she'd found the strength to interrogate a dying woman about money. "Your mother was very specific about her wishes," Ms. Morse said, pulling out several documents. "She wanted to make sure her legacy went to family members who would honor her memory and use her gifts wisely." She slid a document across the desk. "This is the will, but there are some additional provisions that might surprise you." I scanned the first page, expecting to see the house and a modest savings account. Instead, I found myself looking at assets totaling over $800,000. "800,000? I whispered. "Your mother was an excellent investor, Ronald. She started buying blue-chip dividend stocks in the 1970s and never sold a single share. She also inherited some property from her own parents that has appreciated significantly over the decades." I stared at the numbers, trying to process what I was seeing. The house was worth $250,000. Stock portfolios totaling $430,000. A rental property in the next county worth $120,000. And various other assets including savings accounts, bonds, and valuable jewelry. "There's more," Ms. Morse said gently. "Your mother was very concerned about protecting this inheritance from potential marital claims. She specifically structured her bequests to you as separate property, not marital property." "What does that mean?" "It means that under normal circumstances, your wife would have no claim to any of these assets in the event of a divorce. Your mother was very clear about that. She said she didn't want her life's work to be divided among people who hadn't earned it." I leaned back in my chair, overwhelmed. My mother had somehow anticipated that my marriage might end badly, and she'd taken steps to protect me from financial devastation. But how had she known? "There's one more thing," Ms. Morse said, her expression becoming more serious. "About 3 months ago, your mother received a visit from your wife. Hannah came here asking questions about the will." My chest tightened. "What kind of questions?" "She wanted to know if she was named as a beneficiary, what assets your mother owned, and when probate would be completed. She claimed you had sent her to gather information because you were too grief-stricken to handle the details yourself. I felt sick. I never sent her. I suspected as much. Your mother was very upset about the visit. She said Hannah had been pushy and demanding, acting entitled to information that wasn't her business. That's when your mother decided to add the additional protective clauses to her will. Miss Morse pulled out another document. She also decided to add this codicil, which specifically states that if you predecease her or if your marriage ends within 2 years of her death, the entire estate goes into a trust with you as the sole beneficiary. Hannah would receive nothing, regardless of circumstances. 2 years. My mother had been protecting me from a divorce she somehow sensed was coming, and she'd given me a timeline to work within. If Hannah left me within the next 18 months, she would lose any potential claim to the inheritance. But if she waited longer than that, she might be able to argue that the protective clauses no longer applied. Did my mother say anything else about Hannah? I asked. Miss Morse hesitated. She mentioned that Hannah had been asking very specific questions about your employment benefits, particularly your life insurance policy. She also asked when you might retire and whether that would affect your financial security. Life insurance, retirement, the same topics I'd heard Hannah discussing in her recorded phone calls. My mother had recognized the signs of someone planning for financial advantage, and she'd taken steps to prevent it. There's one final provision I need to explain, Miss Morse said. Your mother left instructions that you were to receive all of this information privately, without your wife present. She specifically requested that Hannah not be informed about the full extent of the inheritance until all legal proceedings were complete. I nodded, understanding the wisdom of that request. If Hannah knew about the $800,000, she might accelerate whatever timeline she and Mark were discussing. She might push for divorce immediately while believing she could still claim half of everything. How long before probate is finalized? I asked. 6 to 8 weeks, assuming no complications. But, Ronald, there's something else you should know. If Hannah challenges any of these provisions, it could extend the process significantly. Your mother anticipated that possibility and included a clause stating that anyone who contests the will forfeits any claim to the estate. I left the law office with copies of all the documents and a new understanding of how carefully my mother had been watching my marriage. She'd seen things I'd missed, recognized warning signs I'd ignored, and protected me in ways I was only beginning to appreciate. But she'd also given me a weapon I hadn't expected. Hannah's inappropriate inquiries about the inheritance, documented by a reputable attorney, would be additional evidence of her calculating nature if this situation ever went to court. That evening, Hannah returned home with shopping bags from expensive stores, claiming she'd treated herself to a little retail therapy after her doctor's appointment. She was wearing a new outfit that probably cost more than I spent on clothes in 6 months, and she seemed unusually cheerful. "How was your day, honey?" she asked, kissing my cheek with the same artificial affection she'd been displaying for weeks. "Quiet," I said. "I spent some time organizing Mom's papers." "Find anything interesting?" The casual way she asked the question made my skin crawl. She was fishing for information about the inheritance, probably hoping I'd discovered some unexpected windfall she could factor into her future plans with Mark. "Just old bank statements and medical records," I lied. "Nothing valuable." She nodded, but I could see the disappointment in her eyes. She'd been expecting news about money, assets she could claim or at least count on during divorce proceedings. "Well, I'm sure there will be something," she said with forced optimism. "Your mother was always so careful with money." That night I lay awake thinking about my mother's final gift to me. She'd left me not just financial security, but the knowledge that someone had seen through Hannah's facade and taken steps to protect me. Eleanor had recognized the signs of a woman planning to leave her husband, and she'd made sure Hannah would gain nothing from abandoning me. But the real revelation was understanding how long Hannah had been planning this betrayal. Her visit to the attorney hadn't been a spontaneous decision. She'd been gathering intelligence, calculating potential gains, treating my mother's impending death as a business opportunity rather than a family tragedy. The next morning I reviewed the security footage from the previous day and found exactly what I'd expected. While I was learning about my inheritance, Hannah had been at Mark's apartment, probably celebrating what she assumed would be her share of whatever my mother had left behind. In the recording from that evening, after she'd returned home with her expensive purchases, I watched her text Mark about her successful shopping trip and how she was investing in their future wardrobe. She was spending money she didn't have on clothes for a life she was planning to steal from me, but thanks to my mother's foresight and my hidden cameras, Hannah was about to discover that some thefts came with consequences she'd never imagined. The inheritance changed everything. It gave me financial independence and legal protection, but more importantly, it showed me that I wasn't alone in this fight. My mother had seen the truth about Hannah and had given me the tools to defend myself. Now I just needed to decide when and how to use them. The conversation I'd been dreading came on a Saturday morning in early October, exactly 6 weeks after my mother's funeral. Hannah had been unusually attentive all week, making my favorite meals, asking about my day, even suggesting we take a weekend trip together. I should have recognized it as the behavior of someone preparing to deliver devastating news, but I was too focused on monitoring her secret life to pay attention to her public performance. She waited until I was settled in my study with my morning coffee, surrounded by the familiar comfort of my books and papers. It was a calculated choice of location. The study was my sanctuary, the place where I felt most secure, which would make her announcement that much more jarring. "Ronald, honey, we need to talk." The tone was gentle but serious, the voice of someone about to discuss something life-changing. I looked up from the newspaper I'd been pretending to read while actually reviewing security footage on my phone. "Of course," I said, setting down my coffee cup. "What's on your mind?" Hannah perched on the edge of the leather chair across from my desk, her hands folded in her lap like a child about to confess to breaking something valuable. But there was nothing childlike about the calculation behind her eyes. "I've been doing a lot of thinking lately," she began. "About us, about our marriage, about where we're headed." I nodded encouragingly, playing the role of the unsuspecting husband while my heart pounded with anticipation. This was the moment I'd been preparing for, the confrontation that would set everything in motion. "I think we need to be honest about what's happened between us," she continued. "We've grown apart, Ronald. We want different things. We've become different people." "Different how?" I asked, so I knew exactly what she meant. She'd become someone who could lie to my face while planning my destruction, and I'd become someone who documented her betrayals while planning my defense. "You're so focused on the past," she said, her voice taking on that therapeutic tone she used when she wanted to sound wise and insightful. "Your mother's death has made you even more withdrawn than usual. You spend all your time grieving instead of looking toward the future." The audacity of using my grief over my mother's death as justification for her affair took my breath away. I gripped my coffee cup to keep my hands from shaking with rage. "And what future are you looking toward?" I asked carefully. "A different one than what we have now," she said. "Ronald, I want a divorce." There it was. The words hung in the air between us like a blade waiting to fall. I stared at her for a long moment, letting the silence stretch until she began to fidget uncomfortably. "A divorce," I repeated slowly, as if the concept were foreign to me. "I know this is shocking," she said, rushing to fill the silence. "But I've been thinking about this for months. We're not happy, Ronald. When was the last time we laughed together? When did we last have a real conversation about anything meaningful? When was the last time you weren't planning to leave me?" I thought but didn't say. Instead, I asked, "Is there someone else?" The question hit her like a physical blow. She blinked rapidly, her carefully rehearsed speech momentarily derailed by my directness. "That's not what this is about," she said finally. "This is about us, about the fact that we've become strangers living in the same house." "But is there someone else?" I pressed. "Ronald, please don't make this harder than it has to be." "That's not an answer." She sighed dramatically, as if I were being unnecessarily difficult. "No, there's no one else. This decision is about our relationship, not about another person." The lie came so easily, so convincingly, that I almost admired her skill. If I hadn't spent weeks watching her with Mark Davidson, if I hadn't heard her plan our divorce while celebrating with her lover, I might have believed her. "I see," I said. "And you've thought this through completely." You're sure this is what you want? I'm sure. Her relief was palpable. She'd expected me to fight, to plead, to make emotional arguments for saving our marriage. Instead, I was giving her exactly what she wanted with minimal resistance. Then I suppose we should discuss the practical matters, I said, as if we were talking about refinancing the mortgage instead of ending 12 years of marriage. Hannah's face brightened. She pulled out a manila folder I hadn't noticed her carrying, obviously prepared for this conversation to go smoothly. I've already spoken to an attorney, she said, opening the folder to reveal several typed pages. Just to understand our options. I want this to be fair for both of us. Fair. The word tasted bitter in my mouth as I watched her spread the documents across my desk. She'd been planning this divorce while I grieved my mother, consulting lawyers while I trusted her to handle our finances, preparing legal strategies while I believed in our marriage. What does fair look like to you? I asked. Well, obviously we'll split everything equally, she said, pointing to a list she'd prepared. The house, our savings accounts, retirement funds. Your mother's inheritance once that's settled. My mother's inheritance. There it was, the real reason for her timing. She'd been waiting for Eleanor to die so she could claim half of everything, including assets that would never legally belong to her. That seems reasonable, I said, scanning her list with feigned interest. She'd estimated our total assets at approximately $400,000, not including the inheritance she assumed would add significantly to that total. I'm glad you're being so mature about this, she said, her relief obvious. I was worried you might try to make things difficult. Why would I make things difficult? If you're unhappy, if you want to leave, then leaving is probably the best thing for both of us. She blinked, clearly surprised by my reasonable response. She'd prepared for arguments, tears, desperate attempts to save the marriage. Instead, I was handling her betrayal with the same calm efficiency I brought to business negotiations. There is one thing I'd like to ask, I said, leaning back in my chair. Why now? What changed? I told you, we've grown apart. No, I mean why this specific moment? Why not 6 months ago? Why not wait until next year? She hesitated, probably trying to think of an explanation that didn't involve Mark Davidson's timeline for their relationship. Your mother's death made me realize how short life is, she said finally, how important it is not to waste time being unhappy. Another lie, but this one particularly cruel. She was using Eleanor's death as cover for a betrayal she'd been planning long before my mother became ill. I understand, I said. Life is indeed short, too short to spend it with people who don't value what you have to offer. Hannah nodded enthusiastically, missing the double meaning entirely. Exactly. I knew you would understand once you thought about it rationally. Oh, I've been thinking about it very rationally, I assured her. In fact, I've been thinking about a lot of things lately. About trust, about loyalty, about what marriage really means. Something in my tone made her pause. For a moment I saw uncertainty flicker across her face as if she sensed an undercurrent she couldn't identify. Ronald, I hope you know this isn't easy for me either, she said. I do care about you. I want us both to be happy. I'm sure you do, I replied. And I want the same thing. I want both of us to get exactly what we deserve. She smiled, reassured by what she interpreted as my acceptance of her decision. But I wasn't accepting anything. I was simply buying time, gathering information, and preparing for the battle she didn't know was coming. So, what happens next? I asked. I'll file the paperwork early next week. My attorney says it should be straightforward since we're in agreement about the division of assets. Probably 90 days until everything's finalized. 90 days. She had our entire future mapped out, probably synchronized with whatever timeline she and Mark had established for their new life together. And in the meantime, I asked, we continue living here until the house sells. Separate bedrooms, obviously. Just think of it as roommates helping each other through a transition. Roommates. After 12 years of marriage, I'd been demoted to the status of someone who shared expenses while she conducted her affair under my own roof. That seems workable, I said. Really? You're taking this so much better than I expected. Hannah, if you're not happy here, if you've found something better elsewhere, then staying would just be prolonging everyone's misery. The phrase "found something better elsewhere" made her freeze. For a split second, panic flashed across her face, as if she thought I might know about Mark. But then she relaxed, probably assuming I was speaking generally about her future prospects. "Thank you for understanding," she said, gathering up her papers. "I know this is hard, but I really think it's for the best." After she left the study, I sat alone with my coffee and thought about the performance I'd just witnessed. Hannah had delivered her divorce demand with the confidence of someone who believed she held all the cards. She'd calculated our assets, consulted an attorney, and planned our future without considering the possibility that I might have plans of my own. But I did have plans. I had security footage proving her affair, legal documents protecting my inheritance, and a growing understanding of exactly who I'd been married to for 12 years. Hannah thought she was getting half of everything by abandoning our marriage. Instead, she was about to discover that some betrayals came with consequences she'd never imagined. That night, I reviewed the day's security footage and found exactly what I'd expected. Within an hour of our conversation, Hannah had called Mark to share the good news. She was animated, excited, celebrating the successful execution of her plan. "He took it better than I thought he would," she told him. Almost like he was relieved. "I think he's been just as unhappy as I have." "So it's really happening?" Mark asked. "It's really happening. 90 days and we're free. Free to be together, without all this sneaking around. Free!" The word echoed in my mind as I watched them plan their liberation from the marriage they'd been systematically destroying. They had no idea that their freedom was about to come with a price neither of them had calculated. I opened my laptop and began researching the best divorce attorneys in the city. Not because I wanted to fight Hannah's filing, but because I wanted to make sure I had the best possible representation when the truth finally came out. Hannah had started this war with her betrayal. Now it was time to finish it with evidence she never knew existed. 3 months after Hannah filed for divorce, we sat in a sterile conference room adjacent to Judge Margaret Chen's courtroom, waiting for our case to be called. Hannah looked confident in her navy blue suit, her lawyer beside her shuffling through papers with practiced efficiency. She'd spent the morning texting, probably with Mark, updating him on what she expected to be a routine hearing that would finalize the division of our assets. My own attorney, David Morrison, was a sharp man in his 50s who specialized in complex divorce cases. When I'd first contacted him, I'd simply said I needed representation in an uncontested divorce. I hadn't mentioned the recordings or the inheritance details. I wanted to save those revelations for maximum impact. "Mr. Holloway," David had said during our initial consultation, "your wife's filing seems straightforward, but I always recommend that my clients be completely honest about any complications that might arise." "There might be some complications," I'd admitted, "but I prefer to address them if and when they become relevant." Now sitting in that conference room, I felt the weight of the flash drive in my jacket pocket. Hours of recordings, financial documents, legal papers documenting Hannah's systematic betrayal of our marriage. Evidence she had no idea existed. Hannah's attorney, Margaret Walsh, was a woman who specialized in securing favorable settlements for wives in divorce proceedings. She'd built her reputation on portraying her clients as the victims of neglectful or financially controlling husbands. It was probably the perfect strategy for most cases, but she didn't know what kind of evidence was waiting to be revealed. "Mrs. Holloway has been very reasonable in her requests," Walsh said to David as we waited. "She's asking for exactly half of all marital assets, which is standard in no-fault divorces. There shouldn't be any complications." Hannah nodded, playing the role of the long-suffering wife who just wanted a fair settlement so she could move on with her life. She'd even managed to look slightly sad, as if ending our marriage was a difficult decision rather than the culmination of months of planning with her lover. "My client is also willing to be reasonable," David replied carefully, "though we may need to discuss some details about asset classification and the timeline of certain financial decisions." Something in his tone made Walsh frown slightly, but before she could ask for clarification, the bailiff called our case. Judge Chen was a no-nonsense woman in her early 60s who'd been hearing divorce cases for over 20 years. She'd seen every possible variation of marital breakdown and had little patience for unnecessary drama or legal gamesmanship. "This appears to be an uncontested divorce with an agreement on asset division," she said, reviewing the paperwork. "Mrs. Walsh, please present your client's position." Walsh stood and delivered a polished presentation about Hannah's contributions to our marriage, her reasonable expectations for the future, and her desire to resolve everything amicably. She painted a picture of a woman who'd supported her husband through difficult times and now deserved her fair share of what they'd built together. Mrs. Holloway worked part-time to support the household while managing the family finances, Walsh explained. She was particularly supportive during Mr. Holloway's mother's recent illness and death, providing emotional care while he focused on his career. I nearly laughed at that characterization. Hannah's emotional care had consisted of 3 brief hospital visits and a party on the night of the funeral, but I remained silent, knowing my turn was coming. Mrs. Holloway is requesting 50% of all marital assets, Walsh continued. This includes the family home, retirement accounts, savings, and any inheritance received during the marriage. The total value is approximately $400,000, plus whatever amount comes from the recent inheritance from Mr. Holloway's mother. Judge Chen nodded and turned to David. Mr. Morrison, does your client contest any of these claims? David stood, his expression calm but determined. Your Honor, my client does not contest the divorce itself, but there are significant issues with Mrs. Holloway's characterization of the marriage and her entitlement to certain assets. Hannah shifted uncomfortably in her chair. This wasn't part of her script. What kind of issues? Judge Chen asked. Issues related to marital conduct that may affect asset distribution, Your Honor, and issues related to the classification of inherited property under state law. Walsh stood quickly. Your Honor, this is the first we are hearing of any contested issues. Mr. Morrison's client agreed to an amicable settlement. My client agreed to a fair settlement, David corrected. But fairness depends on all parties being honest about their conduct during the marriage. Judge Chen leaned back in her chair. Mr. Morrison, what exactly are you alleging? Adultery, Your Honor. Extensive, documented adultery that continued throughout Mrs. Holloway's preparation for this divorce filing. The word hit the courtroom like a thunderclap. Hannah's face went white, her confident posture crumbling as she realized this hearing was not going to proceed as planned. That's a serious allegation, Judge Chen said. Do you have evidence to support it? David reached for his briefcase and pulled out a thick folder. Extensive evidence, Your Honor. Security camera footage, recorded conversations, documented meetings between Mrs. Holloway and her paramour dating back over 6 months. Hannah turned to look at me for the first time since we'd entered the courtroom. Her eyes were wide with shock and growing fear. She was beginning to understand that her carefully planned betrayal had been discovered and documented. Walsh recovered quickly from her surprise. Your Honor, even if these allegations are true, adultery doesn't automatically disqualify a spouse from marital property in this state. That's correct, Judge Chen agreed. But it can be a factor in determining an equitable distribution, particularly if there's evidence of financial misconduct or attempts to conceal assets in preparation for divorce. David smiled slightly. That's exactly what we're alleging, Your Honor. Mrs. Holloway has been systematically deceiving her husband about their financial position while planning to leave him for another man. What kind of deception? The judge asked. Mrs. Holloway told her paramour that their marital assets totaled approximately $400,000. In reality, the amount is significantly higher. She also made false statements about her husband's employment benefits and retirement plans, apparently as part of calculating what she would gain from the marriage ending. I watched Hannah's face as David spoke. She was realizing that her private conversations with Mark had somehow been recorded, that her secret planning had been exposed, but she didn't know how extensive the evidence was. Additionally, David continued, Mrs. Holloway visited the attorney handling Mr. Holloway's mother's estate, attempting to gather information about the inheritance without her husband's knowledge or consent. She made false claims about being authorized to collect this information. Judge Chen frowned. Mrs. Walsh, how do you respond to these allegations? Walsh looked flustered, clearly unprepared for this turn of events. She huddled quickly with Hannah, whose whispered responses were obviously not providing the answers she needed. Your Honor, we'd need to review any alleged evidence before responding substantively, Walsh said finally. Mr. Morrison, are you prepared to present this evidence today? Yes, Your Honor. David pulled the flash drive from his folder. We have audio recordings, video footage, and documentation spanning several months. We also have testimony from Mrs. Eleanor Holloway's attorney regarding Mrs. Holloway's inappropriate inquiries about the inheritance. Judge Chen studied the flash drive as if it were a piece of evidence in a murder trial rather than a divorce proceeding. This is highly unusual. Mrs. Walsh, did your client disclose any of this conduct to you when she filed for divorce? No, Your Honor, she did not. Hannah was staring at the flash drive like it was a bomb about to explode, which in a sense it was. Your Honor, David said, before we proceed with reviewing the evidence, there's another matter that affects asset distribution. Mr. Holloway's inheritance from his mother includes specific provisions designed to protect those assets from marital claims. He pulled out another set of documents. The deceased specifically structured the inheritance to ensure that it would remain separate property, not subject to division in divorce proceedings. She also included provisions that would forfeit any claims if the marriage ended within 2 years of her death due to adultery or abandonment. Hannah made a small choking sound. She was beginning to understand that her mother-in-law had somehow anticipated this situation and taken steps to protect me from exactly what she was trying to do. Judge Chen took the inheritance documents and read them carefully. This is very thorough estate planning. And you're saying Mrs. Eleanor Holloway suspected her daughter-in-law might try to leave her son for financial gain? The evidence suggests she had concerns about Mrs. Holloway's motivations, yes. Those concerns appear to have been well-founded. Walsh tried one more time to regain control of the situation. Your Honor, we object to this ambush approach. We need time to review whatever evidence Mr. Morrison claims to have. Mrs. Walsh, your client filed for divorce claiming this was an amicable split with no contested issues. If there are contested issues, we need to address them before finalizing any settlement. Judge Chen looked directly at Hannah. Mrs. Holloway, did you engage in an extramarital affair during your marriage? Hannah's mouth opened and closed silently. She looked at Walsh for guidance, but her attorney was obviously out of her depth. Your Honor, Walsh said desperately, I need to consult with my client privately before she answers any questions. Of course. We'll take a 15-minute recess. When we return, I want to review Mr. Morrison's evidence, and I want honest answers from both parties about what's really been happening in this marriage. As the judge left the courtroom, Hannah turned to me with an expression of pure betrayal, as if I had somehow wronged her by discovering her affair. How long have you known? She whispered. I looked at her calmly. Long enough. Ronald, we can work this out. We don't have to. Hannah, I interrupted quietly. You threw a party on the night of my mother's funeral. You've been planning to leave me while stealing half of everything I've worked for. You lied about our finances, about your feelings, about everything that mattered. She started to cry, but they weren't tears of remorse. They were tears of frustration and fear from someone whose carefully laid plans were falling apart. The only thing we need to work out, I continued, is how much of what you've done is going to become part of the public record. When court resumed, Judge Chen was going to hear evidence that would destroy Hannah's claims to any marital property and expose the calculating nature of her betrayal. The flash drive in David's hand contained enough proof to ensure that Hannah's attempt to profit from abandoning our marriage would fail completely. For the first time in months, I felt something approaching peace. The truth was finally going to be told. When we returned to the courtroom after the recess, Hannah looked like a different person. The confident woman who'd walked in expecting to claim half of everything had been replaced by someone who understood that her carefully constructed lies were about to be exposed to a judge who had no tolerance for deception. Judge Chen settled behind her bench and looked directly at my attorney. Mr. Morrison, I'm ready to review your evidence. David connected his laptop to the courtroom's display system and inserted the flash drive. Your Honor, what you are about to see and hear represents months of documented adultery and financial deception. The first recording filled the courtroom. Hannah's voice, clear and unmistakable, telling Mark Davidson that her husband was completely clueless and that she was just waiting for the right moment to divorce me. Her laughter as she mocked my grief over my mother's death echoed off the courtroom walls. I watched Hannah's face as she heard her own words played back. She closed her eyes, her hands clenched in her lap, probably hoping this was some kind of nightmare she could wake up from. The recording continued with their discussion of our house, their plans to buy something more their style with the money from selling my home, and Hannah's casual dismissal of the man she'd promised to love and honor until death do us part. Judge Chen's expression grew more severe with each revelation. When the recording reached Hannah's comment about my mother taking too long to die, the judge actually winced. "That's enough of that segment," Judge Chen said. "What else do you have?" David switched to video footage. The screen showed Hannah opening our front door to Mark Davidson while I was at my mother's funeral. The timestamp proved she'd been entertaining her lover while I was laying my mother to rest. "This is from the day of Mrs. Eleanor Holloway's funeral," David explained. "As you can see, Mrs. Holloway was hosting her paramour in the marital home during her husband's time of grief." Walsh tried to object. "Your Honor, the privacy violations involved in obtaining this evidence were completely legal," Judge Chen interrupted. "Mr. Holloway was recording activities in his own home. Continue, Mr. Morrison." The evidence continued for nearly an hour. Recordings of Hannah planning our divorce while celebrating with Mark. Video of their intimate moments in my living room, audio of her phone conversations discussing my life insurance benefits and retirement plans as if they were assets in a business deal rather than the security of a man she'd promised to love. But the most damaging evidence came from the recordings of Hannah's calls to Mark about the inheritance. Her voice calculating and cold, discussing how much money she expected to gain from my mother's death and how to maximize her claims during divorce proceedings. "As you can hear, Your Honor," David said, "Mrs. Holloway was treating her husband's grief and her mother-in-law's death as financial opportunities rather than family tragedies." Judge Chen had heard enough. "Mrs. Walsh, does your client wish to contest the authenticity of any of this evidence?" Walsh looked at Hannah, who slowly shook her head. There was no point in denying what was clearly her voice, her image, her words planning the systematic destruction of our marriage. "No, Your Honor," Walsh said quietly. "Mrs. Holloway," Judge Chen said, addressing Hannah directly, "do you have anything to say in response to this evidence?" Hannah started to stand, then seemed to think better of it. When she spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "I made mistakes, I was unhappy, and I made very poor choices." "Poor choices," the judge repeated. "Mrs. Holloway, what I've seen here isn't poor judgment. This is calculated deception, financial manipulation, and a complete betrayal of marital vows. You were planning to profit from your husband's mother's death while mocking his grief." Hannah began crying again, but Judge Chen showed no sympathy. "Mr. Morrison, you mentioned additional evidence regarding the inheritance?" David presented the documents from my mother's attorney, including Patricia Morse's written statement about Hannah's inappropriate visit and her attempt to gain unauthorized information about the estate. Mrs. Eleanor Holloway was so concerned about her daughter-in-law's behavior that she specifically structured her will to protect her son from exactly this situation, David explained. She included provisions that would forfeit any marital claims if the marriage ended within 2 years of her death due to adultery or abandonment. Judge Chen reviewed the inheritance documents carefully. "This is remarkably prescient estate planning. Mrs. Holloway clearly understood her daughter-in-law's character better than her son did." I felt a pang of sadness at that observation, but also gratitude. My mother had protected me in ways I was only beginning to appreciate. "Based on the evidence presented," Judge Chen continued, "I'm ruling that Mrs. Hannah Holloway has forfeited any claim to marital property through her conduct. The adultery is clearly documented and ongoing. The financial deception demonstrates bad faith in the divorce proceedings, and the inheritance is properly classified as separate property under the terms of the will." Hannah's sob echoed through the courtroom. Her attorney put a consoling hand on her shoulder, but there was nothing Walsh could do to salvage this disaster. "Mrs. Holloway will receive no portion of the marital home, no portion of retirement accounts, and no portion of the inheritance. She's entitled to her personal belongings and any assets she brought to the marriage independently." "Your Honor," Walsh tried one last time, "my client contributed to the household for 12 years. Surely she's entitled to some compensation." "Your client contributed adultery and deception," Judge Chen interrupted. "She systematically planned to defraud her husband while mocking his family tragedies. In my courtroom, such behavior results in forfeiture of marital rights." The judge looked at Hannah one final time. "Mrs. Holloway, your conduct in this matter has been appalling. You treated your marriage like a business transaction, and your husband's grief like a profit opportunity. You will leave this marriage with exactly what you deserve, nothing." The gavel came down with finality that seemed to echo forever. As we left the courtroom, Hannah tried to approach me one last time. "Ronald, please, we can talk about this. I know I made mistakes, but—" "Hannah," I said quietly, "you didn't make mistakes. You made choices. You chose to betray our marriage, you chose to mock my mother's death, and you chose to try to steal what wasn't yours. Now you have to live with the consequences of those choices." Her face crumpled, but I felt no satisfaction in her pain. I felt nothing at all. 6 weeks later, I stood in my kitchen making coffee in the early morning silence. The house was mine now, officially and completely. Hannah had moved out immediately after the court hearing, taking only her clothes and personal items. She'd left no forwarding address, and I hadn't asked for one. The inheritance from my mother had been finalized, adding $800,000 to my assets along with a rental property that provided monthly income. I was financially secure in ways I'd never imagined possible, but more importantly, I was free from the weight of deception that had nearly crushed me. I'd heard through mutual acquaintances that Hannah's relationship with Mark Davidson had ended badly within a month of our divorce. Apparently, Mark had been less interested in her company once she had no money to bring to the relationship. The woman who'd calculated every aspect of her betrayal had failed to calculate the loyalty of a man who'd helped her cheat. My phone buzzed with a text from my neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, who'd become an unexpected friend during the months of upheaval. "Coffee this afternoon? I made that apple cake you liked." I smiled as I typed back my acceptance. Mrs. Patterson was a widow in her 70s who'd recognized the signs of a man rebuilding his life. She'd offered friendship without judgment and companionship without complications. As I sat on my back porch with my morning coffee, I thought about the journey from that terrible night when I'd found Hannah celebrating on my mother's funeral day to this peaceful morning in my own home. The anger had faded, replaced by something I hadn't expected: gratitude. Hannah's betrayal had been devastating, but it had also been revealing. Without the recordings, I might have spent years wondering what I'd done wrong, what I could have changed, how I might have saved a marriage that was already destroyed by someone who'd never truly valued it. Instead, I knew the truth. I'd been married to someone who saw me as a financial opportunity rather than a partner, someone who treated my family's tragedies as business advantages, someone who planned my emotional destruction while sleeping in my bed. But I'd also discovered that I was stronger than I'd known, that patient enough to gather evidence, wise enough to protect my interests, and resilient enough to rebuild my life from the foundation of truth rather than the quicksand of deception. My mother's final gift hadn't just been financial security. She'd given me the tools to recognize predatory behavior and the legal protection to survive it. Eleanor had seen through Hannah's facade and taken steps to ensure that her son would emerge from this betrayal with dignity and resources intact. I raised my coffee cup in a silent toast to my mother's wisdom and my own survival. The woman who tried to profit from my grief had lost everything, while the man she'd tried to destroy had found peace. Sometimes justice isn't about punishment or revenge. Sometimes it's simply about truth prevailing over deception and genuine love protecting against calculated betrayal. My mother had loved me enough to anticipate Hannah's treachery and shield me from it. That love had proven stronger than any scheme my ex-wife could devise. As the sun rose higher and the morning grew warmer, I went inside to plan my day. There was a garden to tend, books to read, and a life to live on my own terms. For the first time in years, every choice I made would be mine alone, unfiltered by the needs or demands of someone who'd never really cared about my well-being. Hannah had taught me that some people view marriage as a transaction rather than a commitment. My mother had taught me that real love protects and preserves rather than exploits and destroys. I knew which lesson I would carry forward and which person I would continue to honor with the life I'd reclaimed from the ashes of betrayal. The house was quiet, but it no longer felt empty. It felt like home again.